In the history of Christian thought, we have a broad spectrum of intellects that have approached the subject of the existence of God from different ways, different angles. And for us to try and cover all of those, spanning 17 or 1800 years, would be utterly absurd. Nor can we improve upon some of the great minds which have already stated the things that I'm going to be talking about. But there were basically three categories of argumentation which were advanced. They're big 50-cent words: ontological, cosmological, and teleological. What does that break down to? Ontological is the concept of being or existence, to argue for the existence of God on the basis of existence as we see it right now, from the man himself, the creation, all the way back to the celestial galaxies, and eventually to energy itself. The ontological argument, based of course on the Greek concept of being, was stated by many people. St. Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury, perhaps gave the most conclusive statement of it from two perspectives, both deductive and inductive. The problem with deductive reasoning of all the forms of the arguments, ontological, cosmological, and teleological, is that your conclusions contained in your premise. And so the atheistic and agnostic and skeptical philosopher comes back and says, but you're assuming what you want to prove. It's circular reasoning, and so it doesn't mean anything. So I prefer an inductive formulation. Anselm had one, and others. The basic idea is that you argue from being itself. I have an idea, let us say, of a most perfect being, said Anselm. And since this idea of a most perfect being could not possibly exist in my mind unless there was some indication or evidence of the existence of such a being, in other words, all ideas can be traced to some concept of reality. Therefore, God must exist. Of course, the philosophers came back at Anselm, one of them being Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, and said, I have an idea that I have a thaler in my pocket, which is what we call a dollar. And I can have that idea and believe that idea as firmly as I wish, but when I put my hand in my pocket, there is no thaler. So there's all kinds of arguments, Kant said, that you could raise for the existence of God, but this isn't one of them that will hold any real philosophical water. And so Kant wrote this off, and others followed suit. However, René Descartes, the great French philosopher, came back with a propositional argument inductively, that is, arguing from a particular instance to a general conclusion, which is the way science reasons, and he could not be accused of circular reasoning. And he argued, of course, for the innate idea of God. And of course, then the psychologists and everybody descended upon Descartes and tried to explain away what he was saying. I think it remained for J. Oliver Buswell, who was the first president of Wheaton College, later the dean of Covenant Theological Seminary, author of Systematic Theology and many, many books, philosophical theology and so forth, to deal with the subject in a condensed manner, a logical condensed manner. He was a Presbyterian who, they're very determined to preserve order at all costs. And Buswell was my professor and had a tremendous way of condensing all of these great minds together and putting them into a form that was meaningful for the average person. After all, it's the layman who's fighting for his life out there on the college campus, even in high school now, and in the world, to try and justify the reasons for his faith. The Bible says, give to everyone that asks you an answer, a reason for the hope that lies within you. Well, I think Buswell did that in a very concise way, particularly when he got to this subject of being. And Buswell said Anselm was wrong. There are too many explanations the philosophers have given. They've refuted his deductive arguments. However, I would like to state it another way, and I concur with what he did. Buswell said, supposing you were to find a flat island in the Pacific, and you landed from your ship and you went in and you began to appreciate the culture. The people had never been apparently visited by anybody before, and so very much like Captain Cook in the Hawaiian Islands or whatever, you would see this particular island. Only this is a flat island. There's nothing, it's just almost level, much like the islands which we see out there. And then you're talking with the people, you learn their language, and you notice that they have a word for a snow-capped mountain peak in their vocabulary. And you say to yourself, wait a moment, now, let me reason this out. Here's a flat island in the middle of the Pacific, and there's no such thing as snow here. What are we talking about? Well, one, inductively, they must have come from a culture where there was a snow-capped mountain peak which was lost in antiquity. Or, two, somebody visited the island and told them about what snow was, and there was a snow-capped mountain peak. Or you say to yourself, somehow or other, somebody must have conceived of a snow-capped mountain peak. Well, instantly, you can discard the last one. Because if within the idea structure of the culture there is no word for snow and no word for mountain, then it would be impossible for a person to sit down and conceive of this idea of a snow-capped mountain peak. Absolutely impossible. In the case of adapting this to Christian theology and the argument for being, or the concept of this idea, we have the idea of an eternal, all-powerful, ever-present entity, creator. And no matter what we do, we can't account for that within our vocabulary or within our experience. It just doesn't exist. And so inductively, we are forced up against the wall to explain the origin of the idea. Now, of course, there are ideas that we have that don't have any real origin at all. They're fantasy or mythology or something like that. But we're not talking about this. What we're talking about is something of a concrete nature that we can observe, something that we could test. And when we start testing, we find out, Descartes said, and Boswell sums it all up, that the only thing that fits the possibility of our snow-capped mountain peak is revelation. That God has revealed himself, that the information is there, and that the idea is within us. Now, it's a modified form of the Anselmian argument, but essentially that is an ontological argument for the existence of God. I think Descartes did a good job of presenting it. I think Boswell did a good job of summing it up. We certainly do have to face the fact that the idea of God exists. And we should not be so foolish as to assume that we have conjured up this idea without any relationship to reality. Because if you talk about the existence of Apollo or of Hercules, pagan gods, and you can immediately see where they came from, because they're in human form. And where do you get Hercules, the all-powerful man, if you don't get it from the idea of a human being blown up into infinity? Well, you can't take any of the ideas of Creator from human experience and blow that into infinity and end up with God. Your snow-capped mountain peak, in effect, cannot be accounted for apart from revelation and the existence of God as he exists within our own minds and as he exists in creation itself. So the ontological argument, inductively, I believe has some weight to it. And you can say, well, account for it then. As Boswell would say, God, he is. That's the datum. Now, account for the datum. And when you have to try and account for it, then you are not a philosophical gas in a hurry. I think the argument is essentially sound. The second form of the classic arguments is the cosmological argument. A big word, but it just means from the fact of the cosmos. And you get immediately into the concept which everybody understands of cause and effect. Now, it's very foolish when talking to people who are unbelievers and trying to use a cosmological argument to talk about everything must have a cause. Because the moment you talk about that, they'll jump up and down on you with golf shoes, and they'll say, no, everything doesn't have to have a cause. That's an assumption. So the Christian should argue from effect to cause. Every effect must have a cause, sufficient and efficient, but you have to have causality. And the fact of a cosmos demands that we have an explanation. That is, if we are following a scientific method of inquiry, such as particular instances, we observe certain things and we come to a general conclusion. Science does this. Philosophy says it does it, and I think that we can say it in a very succinct way. If anything now exists, then something must be eternal. Or something not eternal must have come from nothing, which is a very simple statement of exactly what the cosmological argument is. And what we are arguing for as Christians is the universe as an effect, and what we see around us as an effect, not as the cause in itself. A few years ago, I was debating different people on a national radio program, and I had to debate a gentleman one night who was a scientist, and another one who was an atheist and an agnostic, and I think the fourth member was a occultist. So I had a very friendly audience that night, and I was the guest on the program, and I was representing, quote, Orthodox Christianity, close quote. So they immediately came at me with the idea of, well, how can you prove the existence of God? And I made this statement, which upset quite a few Christians. I said, nobody can prove the existence of God, such as taking the deity into a laboratory, putting a piece of litmus paper into a test tube, and if it changes to purple, God's here. I mean, if you're talking about that kind of proof, forget it, because there are other types of proof, and unfortunately scientists forget that sometimes. What we have to do is re-educate them and show them that they themselves use other kinds of proof in order to arrive at truth, and assumptions and presuppositions. Everybody does. Anybody that tells you that they don't have any presuppositions, you can immediately scratch them off, because everybody has some. And we have, as Christians, a presupposition. We have found him of whom Moses and the law and the prophets did write, Jesus of Nazareth. And because of that, we believe we have found the answer as God has given it. So anyhow, I was going on this program, and I had to brush up on my scientific background to get to this gentleman, because obviously he was very well informed in his field. So I went over and I talked to Dr. Earl U. Bell, who was then at the New York Herald Tribune, a science editor. He's a very famous writer now, and he was beginning to become famous then. And I said, I'd like to bounce off you some ideas on the concept of science and the philosophy of science. He said, go ahead. I said, well, I'm going to be debating somebody tonight. I have to tell you what my reasons are. And I'm going to debate a scientist. And I said, I want to approach him in an area where it's going to be logical, rational, scientifically motivated, and then only philosophical incidentally, that we eventually end up with a philosophical position. He said, all right, I understand what you're talking about. And I said, how many possible explanations are there for the existence of the universe? And I was going right into causality, right into the heart of cosmology, and he's an expert in this field. And Hugh Bell said, well, he said, there are different theories. I said, well, let me give you what I think, and then you criticize it as a scientist. That's the best way to find out. He said, go ahead. I said, number one, the universe is eternal. So we don't really have to worry about it at all. We don't have to ask any questions. It's always been there. So why bother pursuing it any further? And he laughed. And he said, well, that's the theory of Fred Hoyle, the steady state theory. He said, but there's a mountain of evidence accumulating, which incidentally since then has buried it, that the steady state theory won't hold, that we aren't exchanging matter and energy on an equal basis, and therefore the universe is not an eternal existence. He said, I don't think that that's accurate. He said, I think also that Einstein would oppose that. He said, because Einstein affirmed what is called the second law of thermodynamics, which is heat and its loss in friction in the universe. And the argument, of course, goes that the universe was, at its initial creation, very, very hot. It is now cooling down. We know that because in our own solar system we can see that Pluto is solid ice. And it's cooling, so it's losing heat energy by friction. So if it tends toward the loss of energy, you arrive eventually at maximum entropy, which is supreme cold, ultimate cold, and you've lost your capacity to regenerate that energy. Hugh Bell said Einstein held that very strongly, and he said the second law of thermodynamics, he said, has not been disproved, and it still stands. So he said, I think that Hoyle has a problem with an eternal universe. He said, I would not subscribe to that. I don't think best scientific evidence indicates an eternal universe. I said, well, we'll scratch that one. The universe is not eternal. I said, no, supposing we look at it from a standpoint that the universe really isn't there at all, but that it exists as a construct or an idea in our minds, and we just think it's there. And so because we think it's there and we perceive that in our thoughts, therefore it exists. He says that's solipsism. That's a big word. It means the only reality that exists is reality within my mind. What I perceive is reality. He said we know that that's not true of the universe. He said because we can predict eclipses. We can predict Halley's Comet, which we've just seen come back again on schedule every 75 years. Unless it hits something on the way around, he said, it'll be back. He said, you can't predict an illusion. I'll never forget that. You cannot predict an illusion. He said, therefore, to say that the universe is an illusion and doesn't really exist at all, he said, is to deny all scientific data in this area. Well, scratch that one. The universe is not something which exists only because I think it's there or other people think it's there. It has some form of objective reality. And then I said, well, then, how about the universe, just suddenly appeared spontaneously? There was a time when it wasn't, and then all of a sudden there was a time when it was. It sort of spontaneously arose out of nothing. And he said, that's scientific absurdity. He said, it's a basic law of physics. From nothing, nothing comes. He said, so if you have infinite nothing, you're going to have infinite nothing. That's it. And he said, so the idea that the universe just emerged one day at 6 o'clock in the morning, whatever the date was, out of nothing, he said, is nonsense. I said, well then, how about the universe was created by a force infinitely greater than itself? And he looked at me for a second, and I said, it was created by this force. I said, I'm not saying the God of the Bible. I'm just saying that it was created. He said, well, you're just pushing it back further and further and further. And he said, that's not going to solve it. He said, if you say, as the Big Bang theory does, George Gamo's theory, George Washington University, that the universe was the result of an explosion of hydrogen atoms, compacted together tightly to the size a little larger than a softball, and that then atomic fusion took place and detonation, and it flew forth with an enormous explosion of light and energy, and it's been moving outward from that focal point of explosion approximately anywhere from 8 to 16 billion years ago, they say, at a speed of 186,000 miles per second. It's now slowed down to 25,000 miles an hour, which is the outer rims of the galaxies which we can clock in speed, receding from Earth, from where we are. So, Dr. Ubel said, that's the Big Bang theory. And he said it begins with hydrogen atoms. And I said, okay, then there are eternal hydrogen atoms, right? He said, wrong, because a hydrogen atom is not eternal. Otherwise, you have to start explaining the causes of the hydrogen atom. He said, and you get into the fallacy of what is called infinite regression. You keep going back and back and back and back. And he said, eventually, he said, you would arrive at God, being a theologian. He said, and then I, as a scientist, would say, well, why stop at God? Why, who caused God? And who caused God's God? And who caused, and who caused, and who caused? He said, so you have infinite regression going on. He said, you can't explain the infinite regression. He said, at least to my satisfaction. He said, but the fact that there is a Big Bang, he said, I don't think there's any doubt of that. There was a Big Bang, and there's no such thing as eternal hydrogen atoms. I said, okay, so we're back to there was an explosion, and probably of hydrogen atoms, and the hydrogen atoms weren't eternal. Right. I said, then what is eternal? And exactly what we began with, I concluded with in discussing with him. I said, if anything does now exist, then either something must be eternal or something not eternal must have come from nothing. And he just looked at me, and he said, something not eternal must have come from nothing. I said, right. He said, impossible. I said, well, then where are you? But at Genesis chapter 1. The universe was created by a force outside of itself, upon which it must depend. And this we call God, the God of creation. He said, but you've got infinite regression. You can go back to who caused God, and you can go on and on and on and on forever. I said, well, hey, let me ask you a question. I said, supposing we just agreed with Bertrand Russell, that's where you're getting this from, British philosopher, and yourself, that we end up with God after we regress back past the universe. And then we say to God when we arrive there, well, actually, we should regress beyond you. Who made you? And then God would respond to us and say, that is irrelevant. The only thing that matters is I made you, and you are answerable to me. It is an irrelevancy to say who made God once one has arrived at God, because God made us and the universe itself. So stop there. When I was concluding my discussion with Dr. Ubel on the subject, I said to him, well, granting your premises that we finally regress in the cosmos past man, past creation, past the galaxies, and we finally end up with eternal hydrogen atoms, and we go beyond the hydrogen atoms, which we now know are not eternal, and we end up with the creator of the hydrogen atoms. And then we say, God. And then we say to him, well, now we want to know who made you, sir. And the response would be, that's an irrelevancy, because you're answerable to me and I made you. So even if you have a finite God when you get there, which I don't happen to accept, I told him, still when you get there, granting your own premises, you can't answer him. Nor can you go into any argument defending yourself, because you've arrived there. And he's there. What are you going to do then? End of argument. Of course, the Christian doesn't accept this line of reasoning. I was using it to show even the scientific arguments carried to their logical conclusion ends up with a finite creator to whom we are answerable. You see? So the argument of who made God is irrelevant and has no real meaning. But from a Christian standpoint, when you got back to the creator of the atoms, you would not be dealing with an effect. You would be dealing with the cause. And we must restate this again, that the Christian position and the theistic position has always been every effect must have cause. There's no possible way out of that in reasoning. And when we talk about God, we're talking about the eternal cause. We're not talking about effect. So we can reason back to him. But when we get there, we're dealing with creator, and we're dealing with someone we have to answer to. And that doesn't make it easy at all. Of course, you see, it's very difficult to deal with people like this because Bertrand Russell came to the United States in the 1950s, gave a series of lectures, and Russell was asked by a national magazine. I clipped the article because it fascinated me. And the national magazine said to Russell, Lord Russell, what would you consider to be evidence for the existence of God? That's a fair question. And Russell said, well, I'm an agnostic. I'm not an atheist. I don't know if God exists. I don't think he does, but I don't know. But if a voice were to speak to me from heaven and predict without error every event of my life for the next 24 hours, even those outside the normal range of probability, beta principles of mathematics and so forth, then I might be willing to concede the possibility of the existence of a supernatural force. Now, I cite this to show the mentality of some of the greatest minds in the world when it comes to religion and to God. Here's a man that if God talks to him and tells him everything for 24 hours and everything comes to pass exactly as he asked for it, then he's still going to doubt that the Creator is there. And Jesus Christ said, some will not believe, even though one rise from the dead. He rose from the dead, demonstrated himself alive with infallible proofs, and you could say, as Paul did, well, there are 500 witnesses that saw him after his resurrection. Some of them, most of them are still alive. Go talk to them. That's evidence. That's prima facie evidence. But it doesn't make any difference, because there are people whose mindset is, I'm not an atheist, I'm an agnostic, and they're closet atheists. They say they don't know, but they live as if they did. And they're not kidding anybody, least of all God. So in making this appearance on the program that night, I went to Dr. Ubel to try and get a structure inductively for a cosmology, for the existence of God. Now, we haven't proven the God of the Bible. I'm not suggesting that we have. I'm suggesting that we have shown that he is the most probable and reasonable explanation once one goes beyond the creation of hydrogen atoms. And you are face to face with maximum entropy, that the universe is turning cold. Well, it was created then, because it's lost energy, and that energy cannot be made up. So until they disprove the second law of thermodynamics, until they disprove the explosion of hydrogen atoms, loss of heat, till they refute the idea of cause and effect, which they can't. It's just an argument that they use. I think the Christian can very strongly stand upon what the Bible says, that God is the creator, and that we may go back to him. He planted the ear, he planted the eye, he created the human being, which brings us, of course, to the final argument which is used, which I like inductively better than all of them, which is the teleological argument for the existence of God. The final form of argumentation, formally speaking, is the teleological argument. I don't include the moral argument, not because it doesn't have force, but I think it's a deductive argument. So I would argue strongly from the teleological argument, which is my favorite argument. Teleology, of course, simply means purpose. And the concept of purpose is very clear within the pages of Scripture. And in fact, Psalm 90, verse 4 talks about, he that plants the ear, shall he not hear? He that designed the eye, shall he not see? It talks about God's creative power in the universe, the purpose of creation itself, the world around us. Paul uses this argument in Romans chapter 10. He uses it in Romans chapter 1. The invisible things of him from the creation of the universe are clearly seen, testified to by the things which have been made. Even his eternal power and divinity, man stands without an excuse. So the teleological argument is a biblical argument, a very strong biblical argument, and I think it can be stated in an inductive form so that we can grasp it and utilize it as Christians. One of the most interesting things about the teleological argument is the concept of the order and design which we are able to perceive around us. And I think the best way to deal with it is to go to two very great philosophers, David Hume and John Stuart Mill, both of whom were skeptics and agnostics. So we're not going to them with the expectation of finding an argument specifically designed by theists to argue for the existence of God. We go to people who didn't believe, but who nevertheless were honest enough to come to grips with evidence when they saw it. And they did. David Hume, in Dialogues on Natural Religion, made the observation that if we had nothing else to go by at all except the human eye, we would notice some interesting things about it. We would notice, first of all, inductively, that it's composed of various parts. Then we would notice that each one of the parts, the lens, the iris, the optic nerve, the various structural parts of the eye itself, within each one of them, there is no capacity to produce sight. Yet altogether, said Hume, obviously do conspire to produce sight. Put all the parts of the eye together, said Hume, produces sight. Now, said Hume, it is obvious that since each of the parts cannot in themselves generate sight, the thought of sight, which is the purpose of the eye, is antecedent to the eye's construction, exists before it. Therefore, you may postulate a creator for the eye. And Hume said that creator would be God. Now, John Stuart Mill was asked, what are the limits of logic in terms of proof when it comes to the existence of God? And this is Mill now, the dean of logicians. He said, I know of only one thing that logic can do for theology. He said, and that would be the Humean argument for the eye. And then he proceeded to reconstruct it along inductive logical lines to show that no specific part, if you took each part of the eye, would generate sight. Together they did. He said, Hume is correct. The thought of sight exists before the parts, so that they are organized to produce it. Now, I updated that in a lecture which I gave on a secular campus and really upset the philosophy department because I said, look, if you don't like Hume, whom you love when it comes to criticizing miracles and religion, and if you don't like Mill, whom you adore as the prince of logicians, then why not go beyond them to science, where you always take refuge? The laws of genetics. We now know, by analysis and the study of genetics and heredity, that every part of the human body, from microscopic structure to the largest form, is all the result of a program known as the DNA genetic code. We now know what Hume and Mill didn't know. We now know why each part conspires together to produce sight. We have now pushed the argument back one more step, and the one more step is the program. We now have the program that Mill and that Hume said existed, only they didn't know it. We know it. We can demonstrate it. We can empirically verify the program. Well, do we believe in an eternal program? Or do we believe in an antecedent thought prior to the program? Every scientist looking at a design program as complex as DNA would say without hesitation, the programmer of this is a genius. Why is it then, when we're dealing with the creator, the ultimate genius, they reverse all their reasoning, all their logic, and all their scientific training and say, well, we can't say that. Of course they can't say that, because they would confront him then. And to confront the creator is absolutely paralyzing. People don't want to do that. I was talking one time with the great Christian educator, Dr. Frank Gablein, who was a world-famous mountain climber. And we were talking about different illustrations of teleology, or purpose in the universe. And he said to me, well, one of the best, he said, I've ever heard, he said, is when you're climbing, he said, and some of the great peaks of the world, he said, particularly, he said, the Matterhorn. He said, when you climb, it's very treacherous as you get near the top of the Matterhorn. They have quick storms and ice storms. You can freeze to death up there, or die, within minutes, or be struck by lightning or something like that. It's a very hazardous ascent, and he climbed it. And he said, when you get near the top and there's a lot of snow and there's a snowstorm going on, he said, you notice that there's a pile of rocks on the side of the trail, which doesn't register at first. And as you keep going a certain distance, there's another pile of rocks. And a certain distance further, and there's another pile of rocks. And he said, if you follow rock pile to rock pile, it marks the trail to the summit. He said, when you get there, you're at the top. He said, this is an inductive argument. If you see evidence, cumulative, that builds, and points you ultimately to a general conclusion, he said, why can you then not say, then God put the piles of rocks there? Because you certainly know that somebody put the rocks there by the Matterhorn. And it was an intelligent person that said, if I don't do this, the guy behind me is going to die. So I put them there, and he said, we don't have any problem seeing that at all. Inductively, we say, oh, boy, that was a thoughtful man that climbed up here before me. But we don't do that with God. Instead, we do everything possible to show that the rocks just fell there by themselves. By chance, you see. It didn't occur at all. There's a story of a little boy who was traveling with his father, who was a professor of philosophy and atheist, and his mother, who was a believer. And they came to what is known with Boulder Dam or Hoover Dam in Colorado. And when they get out there, they saw this magnificent dam, and of course the little boy was just, looking at it, just awestruck. And as they walked around, they saw the mountains and the grandeur of the mountains, and the little boy's mother said, isn't it wonderful? Look at these mountains. Look at the hand and the power and the glory of God. The heavens proclaim the glory of God. The firmament shows his handiwork. Look around you. You can see, she said to her husband, the hand, the power of the Creator. And he looked at her and said, the rocks had to fall someplace. That's chance, you see, that there's no purpose. It all took place by mechanical chance. So the little boy didn't say anything. He just kept walking around. They finally got to the top of the Hoover Dam, and he looked around at the rocks and everything like that. And his father said, isn't it a magnificent dam? He said, look at that structure, that construction. He said, it goes in this great enraptured description of Hoover Dam. And the little boy looks at him and says, they had to fall someplace, didn't they? And the father turned around and looked at him, I guess. It was obvious. The child had more perception than the parent did. The child knew that somebody built the dam. But the father was so obtuse that he couldn't go beyond the dam to the universe, to the Creator, and see that everything is a product of order and design. Now, chance, we must understand, does create things. If you put 1 million monkeys on 1 million typewriters and have them whacking away on the electronic keys, eventually, somewhere down the line, one of them will type out, to be or not to be. Okay? But what will follow it is, to be or not to be, that is the Gesundheitshagen. Because Chance creates, but it does not sustain organization. So you can get chance creation, but you can't get chance organization and chance structure that persists. That's something that desires for its explanation a divine mind. And this is what we're talking about here. There are so many more illustrations which could be given, but the best, I think, that I like is the one given by Paley, who took a watch and said, you know, here's a watch, and if you were to find this in a field and you were to open it up, I mean, you'd look at it and you'd study it and you'd come to the conclusion that it was a mechanism of remarkable design, although you probably didn't know what it was, but nevertheless, it obviously had some function. The parts would tell you that. And if you wound it and it were running, you would know it had some function. Well, the atheist and the agnostic descend on you, and they say, but you know that the function of the watch is to tell time. That's why you can use the argument that Paley used for the watch. It's a deductive argument. So I updated Paley a couple of years ago in a lecture, and I said, supposing, in the midst of the UFO crisis on Earth here, supposing a UFO lands from another planet, or intergalactical, and this UFO sees a strange object on a strip of hard ground, and this object has nobody in it or around it, and they examine it, and they open what appear to be apertures, and they lift what appears to be a front aperture, and they check around it and go underneath it, and they start to look at it carefully. They notice that there are four circular objects upon which it rests, and by pushing this object, they notice that it moves forward and backwards. They also notice tremendous amounts of wires and all types of metals and other strange things underneath it. And they notice that this is a marvelously organized something, obviously because it moves. It was meant to push or pull or carry something. Now, having observed this particular mechanism, they would inductively come to the conclusion that it pushed or pulled something. And from the comfortable arrangement of equipment inside, that you could sit in it. Now, they don't have to know it's an automobile. They don't have to know what its function is. They know that it is a design mechanism, and they know that it had a designer. If you stand at the end of the General Motors assembly line and you see a new Cadillac come out, you know perfectly well that the assembly line put it together, but nobody in his right mind would say the assembly line designed it. The engineering department of General Motors designed it. And the product of the assembly line, obviously, is the car. We can see around us the product of creation. We can see the effect of creative energy, power, and intellect. And we can infer from this the Creator. Now, we must go to Revelation to arrive at the God of the Bible and the Creator of us all. The Ontological Argument, the Cosmological Argument, the Teleological Argument are only ways of expressing how we reach out with the mind that God has given us to try and reconstruct or construct reasons, because we are rational, intelligent beings, and we are in a quest for knowledge. What better ways than to look at effects and to ask questions about cause? What better way than to look at the concept of ideas and ask for their origin and trace them, the datum, and then to try and equate that with some concept of reality that we know, or we can imagine, or think of, or project that's rational. And what better way to see intelligence than in designed organization? These three forms of argument, inductively stated, will stand. They are valid. They can be used. They don't prove the God of creation, but they lead us eventually and inexorably to Creator, and the revelation of that Creator in God's power and in God's time, as He has chosen to do so, gave us the Judeo-Christian religion. As Bertrand Russell once pointed out, and I cite him in conclusion, he said, either all the religions of the world are equally wrong, or one of them is right. A cannot be non-A, the law of contradiction. I think we have to face the fact that all the religions of the world are mutually exclusive of each other, internally and externally contradictory. But one, the Judeo-Christian. And this we present as the origin of cosmology, ontology, and teleology, the God of the Bible, the God and Father of Jesus Christ.